I want to talk for a second. There's a lot to unpack there. I want to talk about the political salience of protectionism.
Yep.
I think that if you look at the 1990s, you have a couple of fringe figures promoting protectionism. One is Pat Buchanan. The other is Ross Perot. Now, Ross Perot, under the Reform Party, he says something that we still remember today. He says NAFTA will be a great sucking sound of jobs out of the U.S. economy. Now, even today, Trump talks about made in America. We have to bring industry back to America. Biden, during his State of the Union, says basically the same thing, made in the USA. That is politically a winner. People like to hear, yes, you know what? We shouldn't be getting our goods from China all the time. We should be manufacturing here more. So,
well, there's a, sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a little bit of a split there. People say that, but the same people then buy their Chinese and their Chinese goods.
That's right. Well, the question then is that I think that economically speaking, in terms of what's better for the economy, I think we all agree that freer trade, trade liberalization is a good thing. It's a good thing for producers. It's a good thing for consumers. How can people who, like you, prefer trade liberalization, classical liberals, if you will,
Yep, absolutely.
how do we make a more convincing case that trade liberalization, as opposed to protectionism, is the way to go?
Well, I mean, if we were going to be smart Alex, you would just point to a country such as Argentina, which adopted industrial policies, import substitution, and has been declining until the arrival of Javier Milei for 80 years. But I don't think that's the argument that's going to win the debate in Wisconsin. I think, how do you persuade people that it is good? I mean, there is the ancient argument of it makes sense. You know, we do well. We Americans, we do well when our companies do well, and as a whole, and we do, and if they can buy their certain bits and pieces more competitively abroad. As a whole, think back to the George W. Bush thing on his steel tariffs. Net, the tariffs did not contribute to GDP. In fact, they cut it, or they hurt it. I'm not going to say they cut it. I think that the problem that you have, I think there are many problems. And interrupt me here, because there is so much to unpack here. I'll probably forgot what I begun with. But the problem is that the pain is often concentrated,
right?
And that, let us take a steel town or a car manufacturing place. The people in the famously, not always accurately, seen as being left behind by the transformation in the American economy in the early 2000s. People, their pain is understandable. And it's very intense,
right?
And what to do about it. But politically, on the other hand, if you say, well, the answer is to help one particular bit of the economy, is going to mean that everyone else has to pay more for X, Y, and Z. Companies are less efficient. They're hiring fewer people. It's very, and this historically has been one of the problems of tariffs. Because the politics are complicated. They're not straightforward.
Right.
And what, in fact, Millet recently was talking about this, but you don't need to look to him, deciding who gets tariff protection and who doesn't, which, by the way, was an absolute characteristic of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, is basically a gift to K Street. It's a gift to the lobbyists, and you cannot really believe in draining the swamp at the same time as you are putting such an area of power into the hands of big government, which is what tariff does.
Right. Well, and then in 2018, you have washing machines, for example, getting, what is it, a 50% tariff or maybe steel should get this amount and aluminum should get this amount. So it's not really a great way of going about things, right? To be picking and choosing.
No.
And is it also the case that you have, in effect, fledgling industries that are not improving, that are being propped up through these tariffs? Is that a forward way?
I don't know. I mean, every time I look at a starship shoot into the sky, some amazing sight, some 60 or 70 years after the Soviets managed the same thing, I don't think that we've really suffered very much. The original argument for the tariffs, if you go back really a very long day, is the old infant industry.
Right.
But we, and I say an American passport, we win at new industries. The dominant new industry of the last 10 or 15 years, and it was underway before then, is tech. And so, and if you look at for example, the people struggling to catch up, there's China. We're going to talk about China later. But if you look at the EU, in the EU in 2000, the central planners and the industrial policy people got together and said, tell you what, it's called the Lisbon Agenda, you can look it up. By 2010, we are going to have the world's most efficient and leading IT sector. So that didn't really work out. So what infant industries do we have that need protecting?
Well, it seems like you have people that are looking at a 19th century lens, right? The Hamilton argument, the Henry Clay argument, and they're imposing it on the 21st century. I want to talk about another thing here, which is, okay, so 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico. Of course, we just got breaking news, by the way, that the Mexican tariffs are now on hold.
Yeah.
But it seems like our allies aren't thrilled with us right now.
No, I think that would be an understatement. I lived in Toronto for a year, and I've got some Canadian friends, and I would say that they're not excited by this whole 51st state thing. And I think that there is evidence. Well, firstly, if we talk about the relationship between Mexico, the US, and Canada, which I think is the single most important, in all of these discussions. We want to keep friendly with our neighbors. One of the arguments for inverted commas, a form of protectionism, is the need to reshore. You mentioned that yourself,
yes.
And that was a lesson that was driven home by COVID. And I think, though, if we can manage hemispheric northern, people going to the Canada, what we get from them, and Mexico, in a hostile world, let's keep them friendly and not punish them. And I think you also trying to calculate what technically speaking, tariffs don't, and better economists than me, Mr. Pino or someone, can explain why tariffs are not inflationary, but they do obviously represent price hikes. And they have some inflationary effect of that. But the reality is that some goods price increases are greater than others. If you have I saw the other day, there's a perfectly fair example. If you have a French wine, for example, and you are a wine snob, you're going to want that Chateau, whatever it is, and the person selling it in the US knows that they can just add the tariff to the cost.
Right.
Other factors kick in, competition, and so on and so forth, and the price increases can be absolutely trivial. One area where they are not trivial is in auto manufacturing. This is something that people have been talking a lot in recent days. And basically, you have to think, we have plenty of good car companies here, but you have to think in some ways as North America as a single manufacturing plant. And when components go to and fro, it is insanity. The Wall Street Journal had a piece on this a couple of days ago, maybe a couple of weeks ago.
And Trump has been sparring with the Wall Street Journal, by the way.
And the is that you every time they cross a border in the production process, theoretically a little tariff goes on, and I have seen estimates that the impact on a sort of average type of car could be a couple of $1,000s or more. Now I don't know whether we don't know whether that's true, but it is at least believable.
Yeah.
And one thing that we have to remember is that the American car industry is in a very bad shape at the moment. And as you can tell, by the way, incidentally, their stocks trade up and down with the tariff news. But they're in a bad shape because they got heavily involved with the electric vehicle business. And in a way, they had no sense. They did have sense. They had little choice but to do it. But that has meant that they have spent billions investing, obviously, and they got a lot of help too, in products that people may not end up wanting to buy. So it's not going to help American workers if the auto industry goes into crisis. And I think I've written not long before the tariffs that the EV thing could mean very bad news for the auto sector. And now this is another possible calamity. So that's bad for the economy. It's bad for the workers, probably, and it's certainly not very good politically either.
Well, what do you make of this 1 month delay on automobiles? Trump saying, okay, we'll give you a month to, I think, 3 major automobile manufacturers. We'll give you a month to move. Is the intention to move industry back to the States? It seems like 1 month isn't nearly enough.
No. I think one thing that is underestimated is the importance of confidence. And if you look, for example, at manufacturing growth in the US, it really, I'm not talking employment, I'm talking production. And there are some questions about those numbers. There's a debate, but let's just take this a little bit fair, as okay. And basically what happened is they were doing fine until about 2010. And since then, that has been a bit wobbly and unimpressive. And the main reason probably for that is it's called the scarring effect, you can look it up, of the financial crisis, made people reevaluate risk. And then on top of that, you had COVID. Now you have got people will now, when they're deciding, are we going to invest in A and B? Are we going to employ people in Detroit or in Windsor, Ontario? They will be weighing political risk in on this, and they are more likely in a fluid situation. They are more likely to cut than to add.
Right.
And you cannot, of course, rearrange your auto manufacturing in the space of 1 month. Newt Gingrich, who is no longer, it seems, much of a free trader, has talked the other day about how, well, there's going to be an adjustment period. Fortunately, he didn't use the word transitory. Oh, no need to worry, this is just transitory. And he said 2 or 3 years. That could be, and he wasn't talking about the auto sector, he was just talking generally. And that means that, no, I think what the month is designed to do is to calm people, to see, Trump is the art of the deal, to see if there are some extra advantages that he can gain. But I do not think that he can reasonably believe that the Canadians or the Mexicans will relocate a lot of their production in the space of 1 month. I don't think it can be done. What you can do, perhaps, is you can gear up production here or there. But again, people are going to be nervous about gearing up. Some they would, I guess, if they stopped, they'd have to, if they stopped getting the supplies from Canada or Mexico, or they became too expensive.
Right.
But they would they'd be cautious about doing, especially if they thought the economy was also going to slow down, and there are worrying signs that that may be happening.
All right, well, let's look at the purpose, because this seems kind of ambiguous to me. Why is Trump engaging in these high tariffs? Is the idea that, well, we need to get more manufacturing back to the United States? His rationale, at least for Canada and Mexico, has been the importing of fentanyl, which seems to be much more of an issue on the Mexican border than on the Canadian border. Now, of course, if you all remember, he's also floated the idea of replacing the income tax, which has been, that's how we've collected revenue since 1913, replacing revenue from the income tax with a revenue from tariffs. So is this a question of collecting revenue? Is it a question of balancing trade deficits? Is it national security? What do you think is the rationale?
There are very, very good series of questions there. On the fentanyl, he obviously, fentanyl is a killer drug and a scourge, and a lot of it is made by our friends in China.
Yep.
We will get to that. I think is a lot of the problem. But as we also saw in the Biden years, the southern border has not been a source of heavy policing. So a lot of fentanyl has come in. I think that there's a problem with demand here in the US. Remember, it only comes here because there's a demand. I think that the Mexicans have taken some action. There's a limit to what they can do. I think the Canadians have too. But if part of the price of all this turmoil, or part of what we're trying to achieve with this turmoil, is to stop the flow of fentanyl, all strength to them. But just remember, if the logic of protectionism is we want stuff made at home, I don't think the science of fentanyl is very difficult. And I'd rather not encourage fentanyl moonshiners, so to speak. The income tax, that is a very important point. If you look at the 19th century discussion, whether from the free trade or the protectionist side, there was a general agreement that you could not have zero tariffs on a lot of areas because you had to fund the state with something, and income tax was, generally speaking, off the menu. I think from everything I have read that it is impossible to believe that we would replace the income tax with tariffs. Because if you sort of believe, there's all sorts of reasons. I think it's just the sheer numbers. And you've got to remember that our share of GDP from imports is relatively low. I think it's 11 or 12% or something like that. And if the price goes up because of tariffs, we all know taxation discourages, and people will stop buying. Now, it may be that everything pays for itself because the economy booms, but you're not going to pick up that money with tariffs. So I don't think that. I do think, though, and this is, I'm afraid, not a very dignified look, but I'm afraid it's true all over the world. Governments at the moment, we're in a lot of debt, and there's no obvious answer to it. And I think we're reaching the point where we're beginning to scrabble behind the sofa to find the coins. And obviously the coins that we find with tariffs could be quite, we're talking a lot of money, whatever way you look at it, but it's not going to wipe out the debt. It's not going to substitute for the income tax.
Right.
It may be an addition to the income tax. And that would be my best guess.
Okay, you've alluded to China a few times now. All right, so this is what kind of struck me. 25% on Canada, 25% on Mexico, 10% on China. On the surface, maybe to the layperson, they say, wait, China's our geopolitical enemy? It's a rising power. Why only 10%?
Well, another 10% has now been added to the pile.
Right.
And there are certain goods which and that's, I don't think it's come into force yet, Frank.
I think April 2nd?
Yeah, something like that. Like that.
Mm-hmm.
We already have 100% tax on on EVs, on electric vehicles, and I think also the bits and pieces that go into them. And I think that what you can expect, there may be some steel stuff or aluminium stuff floating around. What I think you could expect with China is that the ratchet of higher tariffs will continue. But also, there's one thing to take on Canada and Mexico. Now, I think their geography and their history makes them extraordinarily important. But to a degree, we could be a bit of a bully. which I don't think is a great look, by the way. I think, but on the other hand, with China, China is a very big purchaser of US agricultural exports. And people and indeed have already started talking about adding, or they may have already implemented them, tariffs on extra tariffs or new tariffs on agricultural product. And I think that if I was a farmer in the Midwest, I would be very alarmed. So I think with China, because the Chinese can buy agricultural products from other places, Latin America is very much to mind, and they do. So I think that that's going to be tricky. There is then a broader question with China, which is the security question.
Yeah.
Now, contrary to what people say about free market, sometimes say, "Oh, you're just a free market fundamentalist." Not at all, not at all. And we have to be pragmatic about China. And being pragmatic about China means recognizing that it is not our friend. Probably never was. I think I wasn't writing about economics at the time, except at work, but I think that at the time, if I'd been asked in 2000, this is complete hindsight, so you can not believe anything I say, I probably would not have had China into the WTO, not least the fact, if you look at their, this is a trivial thing, but their currency, their banknotes still have Mao's head on it. Why trust a country which has a mass murderer? It's a trivial thing, but I think it's a sign that China had not really changed.
Right.
And we were hoping for the best at the end of history, which I did say at the time, I thought was absolute nonsense, that they would all become nice, cuddly, democratic friends. And so I think it was a mistake to have China at the WTO. I think that what we need to do now is to be realistic. We got, with COVID, the pandemic, we got a real wake-up call as to what China does and does not supply. I mean, I don't know how accurate it was, but you would. There was a shortage of aspirin at one point, and I asked the people in my local pharmacy, what gives? Oh, it's all made in China. Now that may or may not be true, but we are unhealthily dependent in areas with China where we should not be, which restricts our freedom of movement, and to be able to deal with China, which is a threat. And when people talk, so the answer is, what I would like to see, to quote Gwyneth Paltrow, without whom no discussion on economics is complete, what we need is a conscious uncoupling with China. I don't think we could do, or even probably should do, an instant divorce. We certainly shouldn't be sending them anything of technological value, and I don't think they want to send us stuff. But we must eliminate genuinely dangerous disruptions, if you like, vulnerabilities. And that includes, in this day and age, goods that are supplied that would have difficulty in getting through if China was to take a run at Taiwan. The problem with saying, well, we mustn't be vulnerable here, we mustn't be vulnerable there, is once again K Street gets busy and everyone says, oh, we're incredibly strategic and we're incredibly vulnerable. So we've got to be careful about that. But I think we must, it is in the national interest to weaken our economic and commercial ties with China. I do not believe for a second that it makes them friendlier. The last person to really promote that was Angela Merkel. The Germans have a phrase which, if you translate it, it means reform through trade. It hasn't really worked, but Germany is completely, to use a technical term, screwed by she encouraged them, one of her many big mistakes. She encouraged German industry to invest in and sell to massively China, and it was a great success for a few years. And then the Germans turned around and they found out that their clients had become competitors. And I think the world underestimated. I'm sure Putin is pretty surprised about how well China has done. But China is a special case, and I think being a free trade purist about it is insanity.
Well, before we go to questions, I want to ask you one last question.
Yes.
Okay. Under FDR, when FDR comes to office, this is Great Depression
Yep.
era, 1930 of the Smoot-Hawley tariff.
Mm-hmm.
For those who don't know, this is a particularly egregious tariff that Herbert Hoover signs into law. Massive duties upwards of 40, 50%, sometimes more. Democrats take the Congress in a huge, huge way, and they say, you know what? This idea of having the legislature deal with tariffs is not practical.
Mm-hmm.
We have to move it to the executive. So for the last 80 or so years, we've had the president basically crafting tariff policy, whereas before you had Congress responding to their constituencies. Okay, I'm in the Northeast, it's very industry heavy. My constituency wants protection. Oh, I'm in the South. A lot of farmers are dependent on exports, so we want free trade. It was a total mess before. But I am hearing some people today saying, well, you know what? We have to reverse course. We have to now put the power to craft tariff rates back to the legislature. Is that practical today?
No, and I understand, by the way, the people who say this. You've described exactly why FDR did what he did, because if you look at American trade history, really almost from the beginning of the Republic, you see extreme geographical disputes.
Yes.
As you alluded to. So it is very, very difficult to get a consensus in Congress as to what tariffs should be and where they should fall. And what you get is a series of horse trading.
Right.
And it's not guided by economic efficiency. I can tell you it is guided by just local self-interest. And it's the earmarks, but on steroids. And so what happened with FDR? If you watch it, they cut the Gordian knot. We had the legislation passed. There was the gradual progressive liberalization throughout the 1930s, reciprocal. But you could see, if you look what Cordell Hull was doing, you could see the infrastructure is being put in place for the post-war free trading ratchet, if I could put it that way. The machinery was all there. So now we move forward to 2025, and that has really been the consensus in the West. And it's been a ratcheting consensus over the years. But now what we have seen is a challenge to the consensus from Donald Trump. So the old thing that giving the president the authority, in the 30s, he was backed by the overwhelming majority of the Democratic Party. And post-war, it was the post-war consensus really, because it was linked very much with why the war had broken out in people's minds. Calamity had broken out. And so now we have a situation where a new administration is sort of going against this consensus more and more on a consistent, ideologically driven than anyone has since the late 1920s, or even arguably even before that. I think now, if for people who don't agree, I think this should go to Congress. Do read Charlie Cook has had, I think, plenty to say about this. My own view is that there is room, if you can do it without opening Pandora's box, to put in some guardrails, saying you cannot increase, other than the case of national emergency or something, carefully defined. You cannot increase on any one occasion tariffs by more than, or within 1 year or something, by more than a certain percent. I think there's something to be said for that, because I go to the point of certainty. Companies need certainty. Why are consumers not slowing down their buying? Why are companies, look at the numbers, why are companies not investing so much? They dread uncertainty. So a break here and there could be helpful.
All right. Speaking of uncertainty, let's move to our Q&A. Jason, I see a lot of messages popping up.
So I'm going to combine two questions. Our very first question asked if reciprocal tariffs were a valid concept. A later question asked, India has up to 100% tariffs on certain U.S. products like bourbon and Harley-Davidson. Why is this okay? Why shouldn't the U.S. reciprocate?
The answer is that we should. I have no problem with using cases such as those, and I take your word for it. And in India's case, of course, they will be looking at infant industries a little bit, and we're trying to keep them as a friend. But the answer is, if someone behaves unfairly in a way that we think is hurting us, I think that is entirely within the entirely acceptable. I prefer these things to be done behind closed doors, quite frankly, because it's easier for people to back down and compromise and say to India, okay, we understand you're in an earlier stage of development, blah, 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 but this is a bit much and you're much richer than you were, so we want to cut that, and then use some tariff threats in return, but do it quietly. No, I mean, one of the paradoxes of Donald Trump is that he's a genuine nationalist, and I'm not using the word pejoratively, but he sometimes doesn't understand other people are too, and these things are best handled. So I would look at egregious cases, such as maybe the two you just mentioned, Jason. But I would also look at when I was doing trade law decades ago, what we used to call non-tariff barriers, because there are a lot floating around. If we talk about the EU, uses essentially antitrust as a device to basically to loot the high tech that it was incapable of developing itself. Take a look at the size of some of the fines; they are absolutely grotesque. And these non-tariff barriers, I think, are an area of attack. Again, I think they should be done with a little. I mean, you can have your mailed fist, but put it in a velvet glove. I think that works better. But I would attack all these areas where unfair rules, not just tariffs, but unfair rules have been brought in which discriminate against American companies, and the discrimination against American companies in Europe, American high tech, which is fueled entirely by jealousy, has to be stopped. And there are other things like that. And I do think Europe we have to treat with a little bit of care, because we're asking them to pay for their defense, which I think is entirely reasonable. But if you ask them to pay for their defense, you don't really want to bring their economies down at the same time. They're at odds, and countries such as Germany are heavily export dependent. So there is another thing, if you wanted something to watch out for, I'm trying to find the initials here, so I didn't scribble. China, of course, has massive non-tariff barriers. But then you want to keep an eye on this, it's due to come in next year, the carbon adjustment mechanism. And that is the thing that the EU wants to introduce, and I'm oversimplifying here, against countries that they don't think are forcing their domestic producers to pay enough for carbon while they are. And the scope for abuse of that is appalling. And that, I think, is the sort of thing that I would be looking at. The other thing is, I'm sorry, I'm ranting on here, is dumping. I mean, we've had rules against dumping for forever. Use them, enforce them.
Yeah.
Another
Jason?
question: will tariffs adversely affect poorer nations more than wealthier nations?
It's a very, very good question, and we go back to infant industries. I mean, that was America was relatively poor very briefly, actually, at the beginning of its day. And if you look at the rationale, there was a big discussion, which Frank alluded to, infant industries and all the rest of it. The EU, if you go back to a very long time ago, they scrapped the import duties on all sorts of products, on the very poorest. I'm talking the very poorest nations here. Do tariffs? I mean, it's a hard equation. I mean, you want to encourage. You want the poorer countries to get richer. That helps us. It can help us. It's complicated, but it can help us with immigration. It's good. It saves lives. These are all good things. But we have also to be realistic about the real state of development of the country, and we also have to avoid this being one or two times, I think we could do a good deal. Why do we have all this sugar protection in this country? Now, I wouldn't encourage sugar imports from Cuba. Don't get me wrong, Cuba is not our friend, but we pay too much for sugar, and that's all to do with a patchwork of favors. So I think we should be friendly. We don't have to be. Everyone's talking about Lesotho after its moment of fame in Trump's speech. We don't have to worry too much about imports, but what from these small countries, and if it means help them, that's great. But we just have to balance it, and we have to say beyond a certain point, you grow up. Why, when we look at the climate rules and things that are being asked to cough up, countries have been richer countries being asked to pay for the damage that their carbon emissions have done. No reward, incidentally, for the progress that they brought the world for 200 years, but oh well. And China is not being asked to pay very much, if anything. And the reason is that it is still classified as, for these purposes, as a less developed country. It's sending rockets to the moon. I mean, come on. And so this has to, we can help the poorest, but we must be dynamic and realistic about it.
Well, let's define the infant industry term, by the way. So this is a Hamiltonian phrase. This is America. We're talking about America in the 18th century, late 18th century. And the rationale, and Andrew, you chime in if you think I'm inaccurate here, the rationale is that, okay, we're a new country. We have to establish industry. But if we have foreign imports coming in, it's going to totally decimate our industry. Ergo, we need protection.
Yes, and that's pretty much right. I mean, the complicating factor is we were a new country which had had its trade flows distorted by the kindly British Empire.
That's right.
Force for good, of course. And but also Britain had for about 30 or 40 years an immense technological lead over the what you might call the advanced world of the time. And so what happened was, I can't remember, some American, I wish I could remember because it's very funny, but some American writer said, yeah, well, it's not very surprising that the British are all embracing free trade because they're the only people making this stuff, and they can undercut us before we've got going. And one of the critical guys behind this, whose name, embarrassingly, I now forget, was a German, and he went back and basically his idea, he died actually fairly shortly after returning, but his ideas were the basis of the Bismarckian mercantilist state, which he based it on his successful experience in America, which was in turn based on a successful experience in Germany before he got out here. So the infant industry, but the question is, what are our industries? We are more worried. I'm not worried about us competing on tech. I am with China, but I'm not worried with us competing with tech. We're more worried. I'm not worried with us competing on pharma. I'm not worried with us competing in space. You'll all be glad to know that the EU is working on a space law. So we'll all be protected against something, and but we, to a degree, it could be said that we're not protecting infant industries. It might be said that we're actually offering a bit of help in the old people's home, and that sounds awful, which is not meant to sound, but what we're doing is protecting industries that have been around a pretty long time. And how do we either revive them or help create an economy healthy enough that somebody who's been working for one of these fading industries has a good chance of getting a job? People aren't paper dolls. They don't just move around.
That's right.
You have to smooth things out. But I don't see any infant industries where we are lagging behind.
This question is actually someone seeking clarification. Commerce Secretary seems to be saying that all goods compliant with USMCA are paused in Mexico and Canada.
Okay, that's an absolute thank you. I can't read the screen from here despite my glasses. Thank you for asking that question, because that illustrates the problem with this whole question. When half an hour ago or an hour ago I was looking at this, that was only applying to Mexico,
Right.
but the hope was that it might apply to Canada,
Yeah.
and so now it does. That indeed is entirely logical, and I think that what was done by Donald Trump with NAFTA, because remember, NAFTA, as I said, got through with Republican votes, not Democrat votes, and people like Dick Gephardt were going mad about it. Everyone rejected. It was bipartisan to reject the Trans-Pacific Partnership in 2016. I think that what he did with NAFTA and turning it into the USMCA was clever. It tweaked things, and everyone was sort of happy. And I think it's an achievement he should be proud of, and it's something he should keep intact. I think, as I said earlier on, what we're working towards is probably some sort of face-saving solution all round between our neighbours to the north and the south. I hope we are anyway. I also would like to have I know it's a lower rate of tax on the oil because of the Midwest, but we want to make sure that we have the Canadian oil and all the rest of it. And I might add, if we're talking about conflicting aims and looking at geopolitics, which I know that is a concern, if we're concerned about Greenland, I'm not talking about our future empire there, but it's an entirely legitimate strategic worry. Having Greenland out there, empty space, and the Chinese are certainly taking an interest, it makes zero sense if you're worried about Greenland to piss off Canada.
And they were pissed off, by the way. Trudeau, I think, called them a really dumb move.
Well, Trudeau, I think maybe should avoid the dumb word. No, Chupard, take that back, delete. I think the worry with yes, I think that the Canadians, my senators, having worked in Toronto, I have Canadian friends, they're reasonable, folks, and it'll be forgive and forget once this is all gone. But this has done damage for the moment, and I don't think that it is in our strategic interests. Canadians, Trudeau is an absolute bloody disaster. I might say one of the unfortunate things is that this row over tariffs and the 51st state has given the Liberals a big jump in the polls, although the latest one that I saw yesterday in the Financial Post saw the Conservative Party sort of back. They're led by a guy called Pierre, and I just give up. Polyev, there we are.
Yep.
With his name, and he's a good guy. He's someone we should want to be Prime Minister of Canada. We're giving a gift to the Canadian left with this. We're allowing them to cling to the flag that they've made an absolute mess of in the last few years, and the likely winner, if the Canadian within the Canadian Liberal Party, is likely to be a guy called Mark Carney, who I have written about in the past, and will certainly be writing about in the future if he becomes Canadian Prime Minister. He is not a good thing. We don't want him to be Prime Minister on our border. He is not. Trudeau's just an idiot, simpleton. Carney's a smart guy. I mean, he's wrong about everything, but he's a smart guy.
Another question, how will the U.S. energy policy of increased production affect the whole question of trade and tariffs?
Excellent question. Excellent question. We need we want energy dominance at home, and we want it, we want to be the world's, we want to protect our own interests, of course, but we want to be, to a degree, the world's gas pump. And LNG exports, which Biden stopped, or whoever was running the country at the time stopped. I think that was on new facilities. I would like to see a world where and historically this has always been the case, where we take advantage of our raw materials, and there are two different ways of doing it. I think we have the luxury to do it. which is if you look at the great surge in American exports in the, I think it's the first 10 years of the 19th century, 20th century, we weren't really exporting food, but we weren't exporting raw materials, but we were incorporating that in our manufacture, and that made it a lot cheaper. Because we had incredible mineral wealth and resources, including oil, of course. And I think that one of the ways that we can compete without tariffs is we have this enormous energy advantage. And what you have seen, look at the country which is the leading. Put China to one side, but as a percentage of GDP, it's dwarfed by Germany. Germany. My rule of thumb was always 50% of GDP. It's about 40-something% of GDP, and German companies are relocating. They're not relocating their whole operation, but they're relocating a lot of their business or new production facilities to the United States, and the reason for that is lower cost. Well, partly now, of course, fear of tariffs, but the other reason is it's just cheaper here, and a big element of that is our cost advantage, and much of that comes from from oil and fossil fuels. Drill, baby, drill is one way of making sure that we don't lose the jobs, that are lost and the word churn again sounds so unkind, and it happens. So how do we help people? Well, I think a vibrant economy powered by cheap energy is a pretty good way to start. The Europeans are shooting themselves in the foot with that, and if their companies are prepared, if I have my in-laws live in South Carolina, and Greenville, for example, is home to various American to various international manufacturers, car companies, and my father-in-law was an engineer, and we have these natural advantages. Tariffs will add to them a bit, but it makes complete sense already. And look at the numbers. The migration of German companies to the US is impressive. So we should be welcoming. And the other thing that we neglected our peril, and I go back to certainty. Years ago, I was talking to a Norwegian company in my old financial life, and they had opened a new facility, a manufacturing facility in Georgia, and American Georgia, not the one in the Caucasus. And they and I said, "This is great. Why have you?" No, but I keep reading about everyone going to China. Why haven't you gone to China? And they said, well, partly with certain areas we would never go because we'd be ripped off. But they saw what the Germans did not. But the second thing that they said is America has the rule of law. America has well, Chinese roads have got better since that conversation, but America has a legal structure. And he said, when we put the two bits of paper, do we invest? Because they said we looked at the Chinese thing. Do we go to that? Put it somewhere, wherever it was going to be, or down in Georgia. We'll go for Georgia. It's nearby. We understand everyone. We understand how things work, and the legal system is fair. So America has all these competitors. When I look at some of the stuff about tariffs, I think, goodness me, we're acting as if we were the world's loser. We're not. And compare the performance of the U.S. economy with the EU economy, and just we've left it in the dust. And we've written on Capital Matters, which is a little thing frequently about that. Dominic, for example, wrote a good piece, but we frequently touched on this subject. We don't have to hide, as Reagan put it.
Well, before we close the program here and toss it back to Jason, I just want to ask you one last question, which is, okay, what should Trump do now? That's the whole question.
It's the whole question.
What do we do? What does he do now?
I think I think we need to calm down a bit. Okay. But maybe that's just the way I like to think. That may just be temperamental to me. I do understand. I've read I read The Art of the Deal. I
Right.
understand sort of what he's doing. There's too much happening at once. I think there has to be what Trump should do. He has to have a hierarchy of objectives. And I know somewhere, either in The Art of the Deal or elsewhere, he said, well, you just throw everything at the wall and
Right.
see what sticks.
That's certainly happening.
Yeah, which is reasonable if you're talking about one deal. But now what he's doing, he's trying to reorganize our defense. He's trying to reorganize our trade, amongst other things. He's trying to reorganize, and sometimes what we're looking to do, one objective will contradict another. If we want the Europeans, as I go back to my point, if we want the Europeans to start defending themselves properly, as they should, let's not cripple their industries.
Sure.
But we have got all these natural advantages, and I just think the people that we have to really focus on as the rival to worry about are the Chinese.
Andrew, thank you, sir. Jason?
Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Frank and Andrew. Sorry to everyone who asked a question that we could not get to. That always seems to be the case. Thank you for joining us today. Please consider joining us on March 20th in DC for the Idea Summit. And with that, have a wonderful day, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.